find the way to work together with your partners. Build a common impact model, an impact thesis that says, you've got a farm, we've got these interests, we know that these are conjoint and actually collectively mutually beneficial initiatives that we can be a part of. And I think what that changes for community-based organizations, particularly for volunteers, is instead of having to put out the begging bowl for support financially, is to look at how they can become partners and service providers to commercial operations where that's not their focus, but it is their concern. And it is increasingly going to be something that they are going to, if they don't want to be concerned about it for their own ethical and social reasons, from a compliance perspective, they're going to need to pay attention to that as well. And that's where I believe building that common language is about creating new relationships and using these tools as the mechanism to do that.
Thank you so much, Colin, for joining me on this call to talk about Relativ and what you do at Relativ Impact and the story of how you became to be and what you're looking to do to help the environment and people that are helping the environment.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for having me, Callum. It's a pleasure to spend time with you. We've been in touch for the last few months. Very good to be in your company today.
And for those of you who don't know Colin, Colin's the co-founder of Relativ Impact. And would you like to share a bit about what Relativ Impact does today?
Yeah, with pleasure. So Relativ Impact is an impact solutions provider. And what we mean by that is we assist organizations in identifying and amplifying how to deliver significant impact. And the reason why we say significant impact is because we want it to be attached not only to what the regulations and compliance related matters might be, but that it's connected to their purpose as an organization. And that certainly has to include financial sustainability. So what their profitability is always a factor in the way that we look at any organization. But most importantly, it's how they leverage the positive impact they want to have on people and or the planet.
Awesome, that's fantastic. So as I understand it, a business or a charity or an organization of some form wants to do more good and have more purpose. They might be operating and doing their day-to-day operations, but they know that within their company or their organization, they can't necessarily make the change, or they're trying, but they're not making the change. And your team comes in to essentially unlock the barriers and build the pathway together. Is that correct? Or
yeah, that is correct. I think if I was really to boil it down to the problem we try to solve for an organization is how do they create the common language between themselves as an organization and the stakeholders they work with. Those could be internal stakeholders like their team, their partners, their board, their investors, and then the external stakeholders, their customers, suppliers, and so on. How do they align their respective interests towards a set of common impact goals? And those impact goals could be commercial. And as you well know, Callum, these days, a commercial objective operates within the context of a social environment, of the environment itself. And what we do is give guidance to organizations of how to make sense of that complexity. And that starts, interestingly enough, with finding a common language so various people can understand each other as best as possible.
That's so valuable. I mean, in a past business, I was looking to reforest the country through creating demand for native plant extracts. And this is one of the challenges I found was if the various stakeholders are speaking different languages, so to speak, where we're looking at the same problem and the same opportunities from different perspectives, it can be tempting, especially if you're very passionate, to jump forward to, here's the solution, let's do it. But if you're not talking the same lingo in the first place, it's really hard to actually, find common ground.
Yeah. And that's certainly been what we've seen in practice. I mean, if we look at what we do from a technical perspective, it would be referred to as impact management and measurement. And the risk of taking an approach that really focuses on managing and measuring is that you can lose sight of the relationships that really make those two processes possible. In order to measure something effectively, you've got to be able to understand the definitions of what you're measuring. You've got to make sure that you're looking at the same things in the same way, like you do at the dials on the dashboard of your car. or the way that the instrumentation on an airplane would work. If the pilot didn't understand what those things are communicating, you're heading for trouble. And in many cases, organizations may have clarity around what they want to do, but how well it's aligned to the various people, fundamentally, that's what it comes down to, that are involved in that progress. Depends on making sure that they're measuring and managing the same things and aligned to similar reasons.
That's fantastic. I'd really love to come back to this in a few minutes on how this fits into an organization, which you've touched on now. But before we get into that, I'd love to hear a bit more about your story and the crazy whirlwind that turned into what is Relativ today over the last 15 years.
Yeah, with the greatest of pleasure. Well, it was inspired halfway through my professional career. I had a corporate background in developing loyalty programs. So I was really fascinated with behavioral economics and how that was applied in a commercial context. So things that you're probably familiar with, insurance programs, airline programs, where really it's about how these programs incentivize customers to certain behaviors. I became a bit disillusioned that really those programs were focused on essentially making companies more money, but not necessarily benefiting other stakeholders in the process. And I met an inspirational individual who referred to himself as a social venture capitalist. This is back in about 2007, before the idea of impact investing became a more well-known concept. But essentially, his thesis was that business can be used as a platform for transformational social and environmental change. And that set me on a new journey. It took me out of corporate. I set up this organization, Relativ Impact, with a friend of mine from university, who thankfully for me became my wife a couple of years later. And since then, that's been our journey together. Our organization has been a part of how the world of impact management, impact investing, impact finance, we've had the opportunity to see it evolve over time, and how it has not only started to mainstream, but the actual process of being more accountable to environmental, social, and governance criteria starting to affect business practice as a whole. And that global influence is something that we are starting to see. And it's a very inspiring move forward, I believe, for business practice as a whole.
Wow, that's awesome. It's funny looking at the business world today and the investing world today, it's almost easy to start taking it for granted that ESG matters and that the impact that your actions have on the world do matter. But it must have been so much different when you started, and this was a barely known term.
Yeah. It was, I think, a good portion, and still a good portion of our work is assisting organizations to understand how integral these factors have always been to their businesses. They just haven't been recognized, and I don't think there's been a language and a structure and tools and techniques to really understand those. And for that, we need to be thankful to the decades of work that's gone in from the development sector in trying to understand how capital can be used to facilitate human development in various ways. So it comes from large agencies deploying capital into various projects that ultimately impact communities, and how that same set of principles and practices, largely in the context of what's known as monitoring and evaluation, which I'm sure a number of your listeners and I'm sure you are familiar with as well, how that is, instead of being an auditing function, is now becoming a capability that all organizations are encouraged to develop as they start to understand their role and their impact, whether it could be positive or negative, has on the social and environmental context in which they operate.
Fantastic. So if we were to look at an organization, and we're talking about monitoring and measurement and building this capability, in an organization that's successfully implemented impact management and they're managing their impact and it's going well, how does that look? And how does that compare to a business that maybe isn't, or any form of organization that isn't managing their impact?
Yeah, with pleasure. I think that the point of departure is how they make decisions and what is the information they rely on to make those decisions. As I think traditionally is the case, the majority of organizations, whether they be not-for-profit or for-profit organizations, are focused on what their income statement looks like, on their profitability, largely driven by financial indicators. What an impact-driven approach provides an organization is a whole new set of parameters to understand their financial circumstances, their financial futures and forecasts, but taking into account the opportunities and risks that exist within their social and environmental context. So that could be, for example, the impact of climate change. I think something like COVID and how the social and environmental impact of COVID affected businesses in ways that they never considered. They certainly didn't expect that. The majority certainly didn't expect that. And now we sit in, I believe, a more conscious world of how fragile our financial systems are to what are social and environmental conditions. And as human beings, by being able to understand what your impact is or what you want it to be, just provides you with a much stronger set of tools to be able to make sense of an uncertain future.
Right, and when you put it that way, it's really clear the gap that's there in an organization that cares about their impact but doesn't have this in place. But something that really comes to mind is here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, there are lots of environmental groups and environmental projects that are pushing forward their impact. It might be a local community that is fully volunteer driven. It might be a larger catchment group that has $5–10 million of funding. But like you said, it quite often comes down to the balance sheet. And I see these organizations that want to look at the broader impact and they want to plan for the next 50 or 100 years, or at least 10 years, but they're stuck in these 1 to 3 year funding cycles. So going from that problem to the solution, do you have any practical tips or any insights to share that people in this situation that are saying, oh, this financial statement, the money is stopping me from doing what I want to do? How do you bridge that gap?
Yeah, I think it's a challenge that the majority of organizations face. How do you continue to grow to want to achieve your objectives, whether commercial or otherwise, within limited means, whether that's time, whether that's talent, or whether that comes down to your financial resources. What we have found increasingly useful is taking an approach where you are wanting to not just understand what your mission is. I think a lot of organizations have been focused and are fairly proficient at wanting to kind of establish what their destination is. What are the goals they want to accomplish? Their impact goals, for want of a term. And profitability certainly is one of those impact goals. I don't think it can be separated from environmental and social considerations. But the biggest step that can be taken is understanding where you are in terms of your current activities and your outputs, and then how those outputs actually lead to effects that translates to the impact goals that you want to experience. Now, from a development perspective, that has been underpinned by a theory and a construct called theory of change, and has been very successfully applied in a number of circumstances. But in a number of others, it's usually just a diagram. It's a description that is put into a funding proposal without considering the value of being able to map out what the causal pathways are, how you see the journey towards what those impact goals are going to take you to. And by being able to be clear in your language and in your process of what you consider that theory of change to be, you're able to determine what your impact model looks like, your impact thesis as an organization. And by being able to determine your thesis, then you can start to establish not only the steps, but how to measure those steps along the way. And that is the process that we facilitate for organizations, is to facilitate a process where that becomes a tool and a capability that they can apply in their specific and unique contexts. And what underpins that might sound like a whole lot of structure and procedure, and it is. It's applying logical thinking to the process. But what must not be underestimated is how important bringing your stakeholders into a relationship with that thinking might be. And there we've benefited and made reference and certainly seen the benefit of indigenous thinking practices, where it is about co-creation, about collaboration. And those are the enduring factors when it comes to business systems. Money might come and go, but what makes any human system enduring is the relationships and how well those are managed and maintained. What we do is just bring some of the mechanics to support that process.
I love that. That's really, really awesome. And you mentioned about how it's really important to bring the indigenous systems into it. That's one thing I've really noticed going down this pathway is how it tends to force you to take a bit of a longer term view on things. And I just think that's really awesome. So I understand that you're doing quite a bit of work in New Zealand with the farming sector. And I'd love to know, firstly, what made you decide to come here and focus on farming in particular, and how's that journey looking for you, and yeah, just if you're willing to share, I'd love to know how that's proceeding, because in New Zealand's environment, farmers are a huge component. You know, they look after so much land, and there are so many farmers that have been on their land for generations, and they really care about the biodiversity and the impact that their work has on it. So yeah, I'd love to hear what you think.
Yeah. Yeah, first of all, I want to echo your statements about the environmental consciousness of the farmers that we've met, and a number of the people that not only serve the primary industries within New Zealand. The genesis of why we work in New Zealand. First of all, we set up a subsidiary of our business in New Zealand back in, I think it was 2020 or so, largely driven by relationships that we had with people who were living in New Zealand. We felt that we did a bit of a market scan and an assessment of what services were available and whether our business would be relevant there, and effectively started a process of connecting with people, building relationships. In a visit that I made to New Zealand back in 2022, I was doing a few talks around the country with the Institute of Directors and Rotary, and it was in that period of time, it intersected with the government releasing the guidelines, in fact, the forecast of what the regulations were going to be, the environmental regulations that are ultimately going to affect the primary industries sector. So I sat unexpectedly presenting this concept of impact management and measurement to an audience that contained a number of farmers or professionals that were related to the farming community, and asking very specific questions about how this is going to impact New Zealand. Now, at that point in time, I certainly didn't have the local understanding to give them specific input, but what I was able to do and identify is that the place that businesses find themselves in other parts of the world where we work is wanting to make sense not only of the uncertainty of the world, which I think all of us face as business owners every day, but how specifically the responses to regulations and compliance that are ultimately going to affect the future of businesses. How do you respond to that? What do you need to make sense of? What we certainly do not think is the solution to that problem is buying a piece of software that is going to give you measurement capability over some of your inputs. Is that helpful? Absolutely. Do we think that forms a component of what you need to be doing as a business and understanding your impact when it comes to various inputs related to your farming operation in this case? Certainly. But the only way that's going to make sense to your business is if you're looking at it in the context of who you are as a business, what you care about, what your future looks like, what your people are a part of, how they need to understand that process. And coming back to what we've spoken about, looking at the relational dimension and how you equip a team, in fact, build the capability of the organization to manage and measure their impact to deliver three core things, in our opinion. First of all, stakeholder alignment. Coming back to the common language issue, how aligned are your stakeholders on this journey of change, looking into the future? Secondly, how does this support your decision-making process when it comes to that alignment? And thirdly, how does this actually translate to creating value, new value, not just maintaining the status quo, but actually looking at it as an opportunity? And what led us to then start to invest specifically into a packaging of our services for the ag sector is the realization that there was a particular need, and within an environment like New Zealand, there's an opportunity for the farmers in New Zealand to play a leading role in how impact management and measurement from an environmental perspective, particularly from an export market, which you are, into the EU, which is having a large impact on the type of conditions that need to be met, how that sophistication and knowledge and integration of those needs can ultimately be to the benefit of New Zealand and the farmers from New Zealand, and not an existential risk.
That's awesome. As a caveat, I'm not a farmer. I grew up in the suburbs of Auckland, so some people will probably hate me for saying that. But it seems to me, and please correct me if this is not right, but that from the outside, New Zealand's got this really beautiful clean green perspective. Reputation. And when you look at the stats, it's not as good as it looks in terms of biodiversity, water, river health, and whatnot. And there are these farmers that own so much land and really care about their impact, but ultimately they're not the impact management experts like you are. They are great at farming. And it seems that there's this huge gap that you're filling here that's so valuable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, we certainly hope so. I think in our experience, there's still a significant amount of uncertainty. And I think the first response to that uncertainty can be resistance, and well-founded resistance on what the right approach is to take, how to address that uncertainty moving forward. Our recommendation, and where we've started to have very promising discussions, and the type of work that we've been starting to do with organizations in New Zealand, and this is a pattern around the world where we work, is taking a reflective approach on where you are as a business, which is essentially a community of stakeholders, if you think about it. And taking some time, not only just to look at your financial statement, but to realize that very soon, not only will an impact statement of your business be something that will be required, but not to look at that as a compliance-driven process, but to see that as an opportunity to understand your business in a way that is far more conscious of what the potential impacts of social and environmental factors might be on your operation. To be able to understand the opportunity of building deeper relationships with your stakeholders, which is not just about shows our model, the way that we want to manage and measure our impact, but then bringing stakeholders into that conversation where they can see the role. That's where I believe, coming back to some of the work that I know you've been doing, Callum, where bringing local communities into that conversation, local environmental causes and leaders, and understanding the biodiversity issues, a greater opportunity for building new relationships. And instead of it being a business versus civil society approach, a commercial versus social and environmental interest approach, and see those as an integrated whole that ultimately leads to collective benefit in the long run.
That's awesome. In fact, it's quite funny you say that. I didn't catch part of that, the internet cut out, but up the hill from where I live in Rotorua, there's a group that is connecting two separate populations of our endemic blue-wattled crow bird, the kokako, and they realized that both Aitani Wanuku forest and Kaharoa forest, they have an overpopulation of these kokako, which are one of the rarest birds, a lot rarer than kiwi and many other well-known New Zealand native birds. And that it was maybe, I think it was about 10 kilometers of farmland and pine forest land between the two forests. And they said, well, if we can get all the stakeholders involved, we can actually bring genetic diversity, and in the long run, we can connect up other forests. The project's called KEEP, the Kokako, I think, Ecological Expansion Project. And it's been, I'm not super involved in it, but I've been talking to various people involved and looking at it from the outside. And it's been so fascinating to see how this is only possible if all these different stakeholders come together and say, yes, we value the biodiversity. And yes, we also value what this means for our business and our impact. So let's come together and let's do it together. And yeah, now we're actually, the Reforestation Fund is funding some tree plantings for the long-term forest that's going to be going through these projects. We haven't actually announced that yet, but yeah, just seeing what's possible when we come together. One of my early bosses or supervisors said to me, there was a saying from the Pacific Islands that goes, alone we go fast, together we go far. And I think that really echoes a lot of what you're saying here is, you need alignment, and it's when we're together that we can make long-term differences. But one thing that I have to, is at the tip of my tongue is, so when you put a theory of change in place and you build the impact management capability within an organization, how resilient is that to changing winds? For example, we've had a new government come in and that's changed a lot of the expectations of business. Or if you look at the biodiversity credit space at the moment, that's starting to look like it could change the obligations of businesses and organizations as a whole. So as the seas change and as the conditions outside of the organization change, how does your impact management capability tie into that and in terms of long-term resilience for the org?
Yeah. That's a great consideration. So as the name would suggest, a theory of change is a theory, and it is liable to change. So what I mean by that is when you map out what effectively becomes an impact thesis, how you plan to get from where you are now and to achieve your impact goals, that is based on a series of assumptions, and it is influenced by a series of risks. Now, taking your case in point, a government changes, there is some shock, some environmental or social shock to that system, a shift in the relational and logical framework that you've put together. Then what you have is the opportunity of assessing where those changes have taken place within that stakeholder group, within that particular causal pathway. Certain readjustments are possible. And once you start to add data to that, and that's really the key, is that the theory of change needs to be supported by evidence-based impact. Then all of a sudden you can start simulating what the potential implications of those changes are to your impact goals and targets. And by driving it towards the same approach, the same thinking that one takes into financial accounting and financial forecasting, it is exactly the same discipline that we are recommending and guiding our clients in. How are you looking at your social and environmental horizons and the impacts that you're able to measure? And how can you simulate what the changes would be if there was a shock to that system, or if things proceeded along the status quo or along the assumed trajectories that you currently have? And by doing so, it becomes fundamentally adaptive and flexible to those changes, as it should be, as life determines.
Awesome. Yeah, that's really fascinating, because I think it's easy to show up with a certain set of assumptions, and if the tides change, to be caught off guard, and the fact that you're able to build more resilience into it is great. So throughout this conversation so far, we've talked a lot about the theory of change, how it fits into it, the broader landscape. I think it'd be great to put this into a practical context or a practical example. Are there any specific stories or projects you've worked on that could really illustrate how this works in practice?
Yeah. So we've been working with a range of organizations, as I said, in different places. But perhaps what we can do is talk about our experience of working with a farming group in New Zealand, based in the Hawke's Bay for the last while, and how that relationship unfolded was they attended the session, one of the talks that I gave when I was in New Zealand a couple of years ago. and it captured their imagination. They said, listen, this is something that we know could be of help to us. We're facing all these changes from a regulatory and compliance perspective. Let's understand this a little better. So we spent some time going through what our process was and our methodology, which effectively seeks to leave an organization with 4 key elements of an impact management and measurement system. The first is a strategic framework, and that's where a theory of change methodology becomes useful. So how do you strategically look at where you are placed as a business in the context of the social and environmental context that you are nested in? And I use that word specifically because all businesses are nested within these contexts. They don't operate in isolated islands.
So to the context that they were starting in before you put your theory of change and your impact management capabilities in, what was their context beforehand, and what were the problems or challenges they were facing that you addressed?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I don't think they were facing any particular challenges. We weren't asked to come and necessarily solve a problem. I think what they were looking at is saying, we've got an increasing set of compliance and regulatory requirements. We'd like to make sense of that. And this approach, the stakeholder-driven approach to understanding not only what the things are and what we need to do as an organization to meet those current and future regulatory and compliance requirements, we see this methodology as something that could help us understand it. So I really do think that fundamentally it's about getting to that common language I spoke about beforehand. And by having a strategic framework, one of the key processes that we apply to that is stakeholder validation. So not only looking at whatever they are saying about themselves in the current state, also giving them potential viewpoints of what a future state of their organization needs to look like. And once we'd drafted those 2 scenarios, then move into stakeholder validation with stakeholders that they've identified to be able to assess the accuracy and the gaps that potentially existed in those, in those initial drafts. What that then translates to is one common view with common language, meaning all the way down to specifically common definitions for certain terms that are the picture and system of their business, how it operates. And by having that strategic framework, then applying a measurement framework, as I mentioned before, that starts to provide certain indicators and the metrics. So when it comes to the data that's collected within their farming operation, their existing operational information, plus also looking at new data requirements around potential social and environmental factors that they may not be measuring now, but they identify or priorities to them at this point in time, is developing the capability, A, to gather the data, to store it, to analyze it, and then build it into a reporting framework to support their decision-making. Right. Now, once you have the data and you've got the framework, that's the time to start looking at tech and dashboards and ways of presenting that information in a way that makes that consumable and supports the decision-making process. And by also doing that, it then brings, for example, your capabilities into perspective as well, Callum, where it's about telling the story of what they're doing. But then you're telling a story based on evidence, not anecdotes. You can tell a story based on the variance in what they were doing before, what they're doing now, and what led to those differences in their understanding and their ability to deliver on that. And in so doing, whether it's wanting to tell the story about their farm and what they're about, or whether it's reporting to investors, or whether it's reporting to their supply chain, and meeting certain reporting requirements for their supply chain, both local and international, that impact management and measurement capability serves those various needs.
Awesome. What kind of data would a farm be looking at, for example, in terms of their impact management? Like what kind of specific metrics, if you're allowed to share, would...
Yeah. Happy to do that. So, I mean, it would definitely take into consideration what their current operating information is. So when it comes to if they're a dairy farm, for example, what are the various data points that they're collecting around their livestock about their production information? about their quality controls. All the information that currently runs their business at the moment is still relevant within an impact management context. The difference is that you're pulling that information and looking at it from the perspective of various stakeholders.
Yeah.
So it's not just now a commercial approach looking at the financial outcomes and how those financial outcomes are delivered. It looks at what the potential opportunities and risks are in a more coherent and comprehensive set of perspectives.
Right. So,
Is that how-
if I was wearing the hat of the farm owner or the farm manager, I'd definitely be looking at the financial metrics primarily. If I then put on the hat of, say, a regulator, I'd be looking at those metrics from a compliance perspective, from maybe a social labor management, from an environmental management perspective. If I was looking at it as an importer of the products that are sold from the farm in this instance, I'd then be looking at it
Right.
from a different area. Is that how you'd explain it? Or?
Yes, yeah. So from a traditional accounting perspective, there's a concept that I'm sure you're familiar with called materiality. So what is material to the business? What are the factors that need to be accounted for that ultimately have an impact not only on the financial sustainability of the business, but financial sustainability in relation to its owners, its management, and so on. The introduction of sustainability accounting, which is the new advance of where impact management and measurement it supports that process, is looking at double materiality, which not only looks at what the impact on the business and its financial flows are, but starts to look at the impact that the business has on its social and environmental context, and how that double materiality actually has a systemic effect on itself. So instead of looking at a value chain and saying, these inputs lead to these activities that lead to these outputs, and we account for that, which most businesses do effectively if their doors are open. But it goes one step further to being conscious in the accountability and transparency of the effects of their business. So when it comes, for example, to effluents or emissions, suddenly those are considered in the context of their operation. And then it's taken into the context of what global or regional or local requirements might be, and how those actually have an impact on the social and environmental context in which they operate, which is why these regulations have come into effect in the first place, as you well know, is because of the excessive misappropriation and extractive exercises that businesses have been a part of, and largely because these accounting and transparent mechanisms have not been either available or applied.
Awesome. I like that. It's where the rubber meets the road. And, I think one thing that I've personally struggled with getting my head around for quite a long time is that as a consumer that's separate from your supply chains, it's really easy to point the finger at a factory or a farm or a government that doesn't quite regulate the way you want it to, and say it's all their fault. But I'm still eating food that comes from the land, and I'm still driving in a petrol-driven car, or I'm driving an electric car, which has its own impacts. And I've always struggled to reconcile, okay, if the only metric is profit or revenue or GDP, then you're forgetting all the wider context that people care about. And this really presents a solution to how to wrap that into an elegant way of looking at it that takes everyone into account, but from the communication perspective can then be shared transparently and in real time, rather than, and I hate greenwashing with a passion. Like, I really hate greenwashing, and that comes from not tying action and data to it. That comes from having a fancy picture and an anecdote that lets you get away with social license, or seemingly. And so from the way I see it, this is a great way to prevent the greenwashing, but actually put it into an impact that matters, that has a tangible outcome in the world.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, where greenwashing, literally, if you boil it down, comes to unsubstantiated claims of performance that does not exist. In the financial world, that's referred to as fraud. Whereas when it applies to other organizations that are making those unsubstantiated claims, I think that the type of rules and regulations of those are getting a lot tighter. I think the penalties are getting more and more significant, and so that's also, you know, part of the behavioral nudges, and some of them they're fairly big sticks that that companies are paying attention to now. What I think is underappreciated, Callum, and I think you know, looking at farmers and their operations as a case in point, is that there is a lot of negative press, I would say, the considerations of impacts on the environment and extractive processes, but very rarely is the contribution that they make to food systems, the contribution they make to employment, the contribution they make to local and regional economies actually taken into account. And here's another massive factor when it comes to farmers in New Zealand, your kind of small to medium operations at the very least, is that they are enduring business and relational systems. Yes, there obviously is the question around colonialism and all the historical aspects that come from that, and those are questions and concerns that could and should be resolved in some ways, that past. They are net contributors to the well-being of humanity. And what impact management and measurement does is it provides the opportunity for farms and farmers to demonstrate, substantiate what their contributions to their economies and their communities are actually about in multiple dimensions, not just what their emissions are. And this is what I find quite interesting, is that everybody focuses on the emissions, but what about the positive effects that farms and farming has, that the capabilities that we look to build inside organizations provide business owners to do exactly that, to know and to be able to declare with confidence the contribution they make.
Yeah, and if I look at a lot of the wrongs of farming in the last 150 years in New Zealand, from the perspective of biodiversity and environmental health, this has happened when the only measure has been profitability. Let's chop the forests off our hillside lands, which, you know, thanks to the government for putting incentives there, because we can get a few more sheep on it. Let's send 7,000 sheep to Campbell Island, 700 k's south of Bluff, because we might have a farming operation. You know, obviously they're abandoned when the money doesn't make sense, but when you're looking at it beyond just the dollars and you're looking at the broader context, it really makes sense of the contribution. But I think more than that, you know, I'm very involved in conservation, and typically volunteer conservation, and it's very heartwarming, it's very nice, but the money doesn't follow. You know, and we live in a capitalist world. We live in a world where, you know, I wish we could have the Star Trek future where the most meritorious ideas happen, but we're not in that world. We're in a world where you need financial resources to make change. And if a farm is profitable and it's aware of its impacts and its potential future positive impacts, it can invest in things that are much longer term than a 3-year political cycle or a 3-year fundraising cycle for an environmental group. And I think in a broader context, entrepreneurship and business leadership is a catalyst for change. But it's like any kind of tool. You can use a gun to take the pests out of the forest, or you can use a gun to shoot yourself. You know, and it's how we use it. And it seems to me that what you're doing is making this tool work in favor of the future we want to create for our children and grandchildren.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the causes that you work with around biodiversity and conservation, where we see the opportunity of organizations who traditionally have looked at what they do from a purely commercial perspective and are now more conscious and I would say considerate and intentional around what their role is from an environmental and social perspective. I think that creates the right point of connection. And my recommendation to, as has been to commercial operations, but certainly to causes that are involved in conservation, is find the way to work together with your partners. build a common impact model, an impact thesis that says, you've got a farm, we've got these interests, we know that these are conjoint and actually collectively mutually beneficial initiatives that we can be a part of. And I think what that changes for community-based organizations, particularly for volunteers, is instead of having to put out the begging bowl for support financially, is to look at how they can become partners and service providers to commercial operations where that's not their focus, but it is their concern. And it is increasingly going to be something that they are going to, if they don't want to be concerned about it for their own ethical and social reasons, from a compliance perspective, they're going to need to pay attention to that as well. And that's where I believe building that common language is about creating new relationships and using these tools as the mechanism to do that.
That's awesome, mate. Yeah, I found this discussion so fascinating, and I just want to say again, thank you so much for taking the time to meet today and for sharing how impact management fits into the future we're creating as a species, and you know, where the rubber meets the road and in a really practical sense. We've covered from the high level right down to the ground level. So let's say someone's listening to this and they want to work with you. How can people find out about you, and what's the process to become a partner or a client of yours?
Yeah, a very simple process. Just get in touch with us. You can take a look at our website, which is relativimpact.com. And you can catch us on LinkedIn. A lot of what we're doing and publishing our work and the things that we do. I'll leave my contact details with you as well, Callum. Very happy to share that with your listeners and the people that might be watching this. And we look forward to building a relationship with you. That's really our first intention, and look forward to supporting you in that process.
Fantastic, and likewise. And just lastly, are there any final thoughts you would share on how people can start thinking about the impact they make and what to change, just as a first little mini, if they haven't even thought about it yet, what's the first thing they should consider?
Yeah. One of the ways that we usually engage groups of people when we first meet them is to ask them the question, what is your dream destination? If you were to picture, and it was a postcard of where you want to get to, it could be, you know, a dream holiday destination. But in the context of your business, what does that look like? Now, how do you determine your journey from where you are now? The two things that you can safely know is what your point of departure is and what your destination is, and to consider the journey towards the impact you want to be responsible for, that you want to be proud of, that you want to participate in. What are the steps along that journey to take? Like you'd have to get in a mode of transport to get to your dream destination, this is going to be the same type of feeling. It's not going to be straightforward, but as you start to practice, it's going to get easier and easier and easier to figure it out. But by the time you get to that destination, as we all know, part of the joy of getting there was the journey that you took. And yeah, that is what we'd be happy to support you with. So thanks a lot, Colin, for the time that you've given me to talk to you.
Thank you, Colin. Cheers, appreciate it.